it would indeed be a good idea to start at this point. It's 5:05 local time, and I would like to welcome everybody at the Colloquium of the Department of Theoretical and Applied Linguistics. And Andrei Kibrik will introduce our today's speaker.
Yeah, hello everybody. It's my pleasure to be introducing Yaron Matras' talk. Yaron is the major specialist in language contact, first and foremost, of course, in a number of other fields that I will mention briefly. Probably many people know his book called Language Contact, published in 2009 by Cambridge. A very, very influential book that shows us a modern approach to this fascinating field. Currently, Yaron is affiliated with Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics, as well as the Department of Hebrew at the University of Haifa. However, for many years, he was working at the University of Manchester, where he led the Manchester Working Group on Language Contact, also the Romani project, and a very interesting project on multilingual Manchester, on which we collaborated some years ago. In his work, Yaron contributed to many fields of language studies, including, as I already mentioned, contact linguistics, also linguistic typology, language documentation, discourse pragmatics, language policy, urban multilingualism, and also, as I find out just recently, forensic linguistics. As for languages that he's or has been working on, these include, of course, Romani, about which we're going to hear today a lot, as well as Yiddish, also some German dialects, and various languages of the Near East, including Kurdish, Arabic, Hebrew, Domari, Turkish, and also what he calls Sondersprachen, that is some special languages, otherwise called secret languages. Yaron Matras published several major books about Romani, including a linguistic introduction to this language, Romani in Britain, with the subtitle The Afterlife of a Language, and also a grammar of Domari, a different language closely related to Romani. And this is a very spectacular variety of topics, and I won't be taking more of Yaron's time. And thank you very much, Yaron, for coming to our colloquium, for joining us today, and you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much for the invite and for this very, very generous introduction. I very much wish I could be in Moscow with you. I have so fond memories of my recent visits. But obviously post-COVID, we've all gotten accustomed to this remote virtual medium of meetings, and it's bringing us together from all parts of the world under all sorts of circumstances. So I'm glad we have this opportunity. And I'd like to combine several kind of areas of interests of mine. And the first is language contact, and how do we theorize language contact beyond the descriptive accounts, of which we've had many in past decades, about individual details of how languages can influence one another. What do we make of that, and what lessons can we learn from observations on language contact, not just about language change, but about the language faculty as such? How is the language facility university constructed? And I'm going to, toward the end of the talk, dare to venture into a speculative field, but one nonetheless that people have been indulging in for a couple of decades at least, which is the idea of the evolution of the language faculty. Where does language come from? And how did it evolve? And I will add my own speculations to the field, based on and informed to the extent that one can make an informed contribution to that particular speculative field from observations on language contact. Now, of course, there are numerous settings in which contact can be observed, but I will make special reference to Romany, partly because Romany is just such an interesting laboratory of language contact. We have basically all varieties of Romany that are permanently in contact with other languages. There are no monolingual, certainly no adult monolingual Romany speakers. And because of the geographical dispersion of Romany, Romany dialects are in contact with a great variety of different languages, of different language types, and of different structural features. So that gives us some degree of variability in the types of contacts as far as the formal structural side is concerned, while at the same time, in the convenient conditions of a laboratory-like situation, the sociolinguistic conditions, which of course are very decisive in determining the power relations between languages and therefore also the outcome of language contact, those sociolinguistic conditions are virtually the same or very, very similar in all settings where Romany is spoken. So Romany is always a minority language. It is always a language that lacks any formal institutions that support it. It lacks, any political institutions, even that represent the population. It is always the language of, however, of work interaction, because work is never within Romany communities. It is always associated with a customer audience of non-Romany people. And so it is tokenistic of identity, of family identity primarily. And yet the contact language is used for pretty much everything in dealings with other outside populations, which are extensive and existential. And above all, bilingualism in Romany is always unidirectional. Romany populations always learn the languages of those around them. Those around them virtually never learn the language of the Roma, with very few exceptions. Most of them linguists or missionaries, but otherwise people don't usually learn Romany. So Romany is an interesting experimental field for generalizations on contact. But of course, over the years, some of the things that I and my collaborators have been able to observe and generalize with regard to samples from Romany have also been observed or confirmed or looked at with respect to other language samples. And so I believe that much can be said that a lot of the things that we observe in Romany are actually universal. They're there not because of something particular to Romany, but they represent general trends. So what I'd like to do is to start with a few principles of language contact, then give a little bit of historical context about Romany, look a little at contact developments in Romany, come to an idea that I formulated some years ago, but others have also looked at, and that is, how is contact-related change related to different categories, so split across different functional categories of language, and how that in turn relates to the executive control. So how do we as users of language control the selection of linguistic forms from the repertoire, in particular in multilingual settings where we have forms that are equivalent or near equivalent in meaning and function, but of course not equivalent in terms of when they can be deployed, in which setting and with which audience. And with that, I will conclude with some implications for a theory of the evolution of language, of the language faculty as such. Now, our big breakthrough in modern linguistics is always considered, and this is kind of where our linguistic upbringing catches up with us, in the view of language as a system, something that is not just kind of given by God or just there for aesthetic reasons, but is systematic. And that is the foundation of structural and formal linguistics. And within that lens, language contact is viewed as, or language diversity as two systems or more, and language contact as somehow one system coming in touch and getting in touch with another system. This, of course, is a metaphor. Languages don't actually touch one another physically, of course. It's a metaphor that we've been using, but I'd like to argue that it's time in a post-structuralist era to let go of that metaphor and move on to something else. And first of all, go back to basics. The basics are that language contact is about different populations that speak different languages. Now here, of course, the big debate emerges, is it just different languages or closely related varieties or different dialects? I think it's a continuum for the time being. Well, we'll just draw the line around mutual intelligibility, which can be fluid. It can be non-objective, but subjective. So close to perception. You know, there are related languages where one side says we understand the others, but the other side says we don't understand the first. So some of it is subjective, but let's kind of cross the line there around mutual intelligibility. More or less, it gives us that flexibility. But basically, we have populations that speak different languages among themselves, and they come into contact. That's where contact actually occurs. They need to communicate with one another. And in such situations, at the very least, individuals, sometimes the entire population, sometimes both populations, sometimes certain sectors within one or both populations, but at the very least, certain individuals emerge who acquire a complex repertoire of features. Features meaning forms, structures, habits, practice routines, everything that is needed in order to communicate. So what we call language systems that we would put into a descriptive grammar and beyond, okay, the usage roles. And that complex repertoire of features allows them to maintain a separation or a mental demarcation that allows them to communicate with both populations, okay? Again, that can be unidirectional, it can be universal, or it can be just limited to individuals. That demarcation line, that demarcation line, however, is the product of, is acquired through socialization, but it's something that we need to constantly maintain. We cannot switch a language on and off just mechanically. We have to always work to maintain that separation. Now we have the ability to do that. It is natural. It is acquired through socialization. The infants who grow up with more than one language take time until they learn to separate, draw that demarcation line within their repertoires, but they are able to do so. People are also able to give themselves discounts to loosen the separation if the conditions allow that. My principal approach here to contact is to rely on an idea that contact involves a practice. It is the practice of drawing separation lines, drawing mental imagined demarcation lines within the integrated overall repertoire of linguistic features, an ability that is acquired through socialization, that is constantly maintained, and that people have to constantly work on in order to maintain, and something that is in principle permeable because practice routines can change. Language contact, what we regard as one system adopting from another system, is in reality a group of users who have changed their language behavior. They have changed the mode through which they draw that demarcation line and accept at some point that certain forms and certain features might belong on both sides of the equation. So when speaking with both populations, that is the reality of language contact. the representation as a system-related change is an abstraction that we as analysts of language carry out while sitting at our desks. So what are the possible triggers for such changes in where that imaginary demarcation line is set, the changes in behavior? Well, in my understanding, there are basically three pull factors that are at work here in managing the multilingual repertoire, and that are in competition with one another. And so the outcome, any outcome, which we then as analysts of language perceive as change, any outcome is the product of a balancing act of these different pull factors. The first pull factor, and perhaps the most obvious in multilingual settings, is what I call the context-bound selection of forms from the repertoire. And that simply means, in everyday normal terms, speaking the right language in the right situation, with the right person or on the right topic. So assuming that, you know, in any given, whether it's the interlocutor or the place of speech, speaking, or the topic on which we speak, or whatever it is, that not all forms are can be deployed there, but that we have to carry out a selection of certain forms and an inhibition of other forms that may be functionally or in terms of meaning adequate, but are not adequately selected because they're not the ones that are expected, they're not appropriate for that particular setting, or they might not be effective for communication. At the same time, speakers naturally wish to exploit the full expressive potential of the repertoire. And that means that if there are things that can be expressed in one language, there is an urge to be able to express them in the other language as well, and not be deprived of that expressive potential when communicating with the other population, let's just say, or in the other language. And that can take on various different directions. It can simply be through generalization of a word or a feature throughout the repertoire, so it can be used among everybody. Or it can be done in the manner of what I call pattern replication, so a kind of a compromise that we take a particular form, meaning, relationship that we find in one language, and we recreate it using the formal structures, the matter of the other language, what is often called convergence, or contact-induced grammaticalisation, or metatypy, or there have been various ways, calcs of looking at that. And the final pull factor is the urge to reduce hurdles in the way of efficient communication. Constantly having to select the correct forms and inhibit those that are incorrect. And by correct and incorrect, I mean appropriate or inappropriate for the particular situation, that, in other words, in the right language or not in the right language. Constantly having to monitor and select out of one's repertoire is a huge load on language processing. Now, we are able to do that. We are proficient speakers, and many people speak several languages around the world. And yet, there is a clash with that cognitive load that this imposes, particularly when we are confronted with interaction situations in which a high tension is involved in terms of managing the interaction. And I'll show some examples. But unlike perhaps lexical meanings, managing the interaction is a very complex task. So everything that has to do with managing the interaction, from the intonation patterns that are meaningful, to the use of discourse markers and connectors, to the ways in which we organize speech and utterances, so information structure, and those kind of things. If we can allow them to converge and have just one set instead of two to choose from, that can make communication more efficient without compromising the context-bound selection of forms from the repertoire, or while compromising them, but only for particular sets. So that gives a further motivation, which is not about necessarily expressive potential, but another motivation to level off forms and structures within the repertoire, and to allow languages to become more similar, to converge or to fuse. And I'll make this clear with examples as we proceed. So my preliminary assumptions is, once again, that speakers have a repertoire, not languages. Languages is a social construction. Infants are able to separate, infants who grow up in multilingual settings are able to separate their languages long before they know how to label them, usually. And the borderline between what is a language, what is a variety, what is a dialect is, as we know, of course, also very fluid. So languages are a social convention. Speakers have a repertoire. And within that repertoire, they know how to select the features that are appropriate for a particular context. Change, any change in language, is the outcome of innovations in discourse. Now, not every innovation in discourse will lead to language change. Some can be spontaneous, they can be individual, they can be one-off, but there is no change in language that is not somehow the outcome of an individual innovation in discourse. So from a methodological point of view, the way to study change is to look at discourse. And here I think there's been traditionally a serious gap in work in contact linguistics, because work in contact linguistics has traditionally been divided between historical linguistics and discourse or conversation analysis. And then, of course, societal aspects, language sociology, and to some extent typology as well. But there's been very, very little attempts to combine the two, or even to for kind of mutual citation. So we need an approach that is integrated, that looks at discourse and understands discourse as the place in which innovations take place, which in turn is what leads to language change. And innovations in discourse are linked to the function of structural categories. They are not randomly distributed. And functional categories, structural categories, are not just slots in a fully formed, well-formed sentence. They are basically different mental processing tasks that are involved in communication. So what we normally in linguistics look at as parts of speech or word classes, again, are not just differentiated through their inflectional potential or their sentential distribution. They are differentiated in regard to the actions that they instigate, the mental processing actions that they instigate. So if I say to somebody window, I create an image of an object. But if I say already, then I'm processing a certain expectation in regard to the temporal sequence of events that is implied, and so on and so forth. So these are completely different tasks. They're not just different words with different kinds of inflection. And my argument is that it is those tasks that give us the key to how comfortable it is for speakers to maintain separation within their repertoire according to language, or to drive toward a kind of a fusion or convergence of those structures. And so in that sense, language contact, or studying language contact, also gives us insights into a theory of language altogether. So a theory of how do we categorize in language, and how do we understand structural categories. And finally, contact-induced change is hierarchical. And so that hierarchy requires an explanation that would seek to answer the question, what properties in a given hierarchy are the ones that instigate change in a context situation? And change, as I pointed out in the previous slide, in a context situation, is a change of behavior that is the outcome of a change in the balancing act of these different pull factors. Okay, and that outcome is hierarchically arranged. So different categories are prone in different ways to that kind of change. In other words, to the effort to balance the different pull factors. So let's go over to the Romani population and the Romani language, and I won't go into too much ethnographic characterization, but obviously the Romani population have a sort of a unique position in European society, in that traditionally they have occupied particular socioeconomic niches. So it's traditionally, historically, been a population that is a service-providing population that provides services to the sedentary or surrounding population. Some of that has been connected to traveling for work purposes, but not entirely. There are Romani settlements that have been in place for hundreds of years in many places in Southeast and Central Europe in particular, and where service-providing populations live alongside the populations that to whom they provide services and have been doing so for centuries. So traveling is to some extent a stereotype, but one that is a tradition that remains in some Romani communities, particularly Western European fringe nowadays. The dialectological map, as I will show in a moment, of Romani shows very strongly that even where traveling remains as a way of doing business, basically, I won't say a lifestyle, but rather a way of reaching client populations, that traveling has been contained because dialect patterns in Romani are very much geographical. They're astonishingly similar to the dialect patterns that we find in so-called sedentary or traditionally farming populations. If Romani people had been traveling at random, then we would not likely to find geographical patterns in the distribution of isoglosses in Romani. That means that traveling is contained, and that makes sense from an ethnographic perspective. If you do travel to your customers, as many Romani people in Britain, for example, that I know do, you're very reliant on your permanent network of contacts. You need to know where your suppliers are, where your clients are. You need to have local knowledge. So precisely the itinerant, peripatetic, as we call it, commercial economy relies very much on a permanent structure. So you travel very much locally. The traveling is regionally contained. Now, traveling in that regard must be distinguished from migration. Like every other population, Roma also migrate. So just like Polish people migrate to America at some point, and Serbian people to South America or whatever, Romani people also migrate. And of course, as a marginalized, weak ethnic minority, they migrate even more frequently because they are also subject not just to the general economic hardships of the environments in which they live, but also particularly to persecution and discrimination, which they seek to escape. So there are migrations. So migrations, of course, change the pattern of the linguistic landscapes, but they do not contradict the principle of geographical picture of isoglosses that is historically there, as I will show. The Rom call themselves Rom in their language, and their language Romanes or Romane or something similar. There are also a variety of names, some related and some not, that Romani populations use to refer to themselves, among them Romatzel or Romanicel, Kale, which means black people or dark people, Manush, which means people, as well as various words that are loan words into the Romani language adopted from surrounding populations. Some of them, for example, can be, many of them are designations of traditional occupations, words carried over particularly from Turkish and from Romanian, sometimes from Hungarian, such as sepetçi, basket weavers, or kildarash, manufacturers of cauldrons or something like that, or metal workers, and many such horse dealers, many such occupational terms, which of course nowadays refer to the dialect or a set of customs, no longer necessarily to the present-day occupations. Romanes technically means in a Roma manner. And so to speak Romanes means to speak in a Roma manner. And Rom Romni are also the words that are used for man or woman or husband and wife who are part of the group. And there is, of course, in cases where, quite amusingly, ambiguity when somebody marries somebody from outside the community, then they might be the Romni as their wife, but they're not a Romni because they're not, not ethnically part of the group. So those are the designations. And the word is cognate with the appellations of other groups with a peripatetic, so itinerant trade tradition, who live in West Asia and the Middle East, who also maintain Indic languages. So these languages are related to Romani, they're not necessarily dialects of Romani, and the migration, all of them relate to the caste name Dom, which is found still in India these days as a designation for a particular portfolio of occupations and particular caste study status. They are linguistically not identical, so they live in different places and speak dialects of the languages, regional languages of the regions in which they live. So this is clearly a caste designation, and the communities that we find in the previous map are not understood to have been one single emigration from India, but rather a successive immigration of different groups speaking different Indian languages, but all belonging to that kind of caste category, which have kept their socioeconomic profile and to a large degree their languages as well. So they continued to have the same function that they had within the Indian caste system within the Middle Eastern and European societies. It is kind of thought that Romani started off as a kind of a central Indian language. There are some sound developments that are cohesive with the kind of the first millennium, late Old Indo-Aryan development, early Middle Indo-Aryan development in central India, but that there was then a movement to the northwest, which accounts both for the retention of some conservative forms, but also for a number of innovations that are shared, for example, with languages like Kashmiri that are spoken in the northwest, and later also to some extent with Iranian languages. And from there, an immigration to Europe. Quite often in popular depictions, it is said that the Roma come from Punjab or northwest India, and that is not wrong in the sense that at some point they were in Punjab or northwest India. But the original core, or the more archaic core of Romani, is Central Indic. And Romani is quite distinctive in that it is very conservative in certain inflectional patterns. So it's one of the very few modern Indian languages that retains elements of the Middle Indic present verb conjugation, for example. But it is innovative in other areas, for example, the creation of the new past tense conjugation, which doesn't exist by and large in most modern languages of India, except in the Northwest. We then speak of early Romani in early medieval times, which will have been spoken in contact with Byzantine Greek. The exact circumstances are unknown because there's no historical documentation. But the impact of Greek is very, very strong and very uniform on all dialects of Romani. And it is for that reason that already in the late 19th century, Franz Miklosic said a Greek-speaking area was the European homeland of the Roma. So Greek had an enormous impact on Romani. And then the historical period already shows attestation of migrations of Roma from Southeast Europe in different directions all across the European continent. And we can assume that there is then a period of settlement from the 16th century onwards, which is where dialect differentiation started. I mean, not to say that any language can ever be completely uniform, but that the split into the dialects that we saw today took place pretty much around this time between the 16th and 18th centuries. And some evidence of that is that already the earliest attestation of Romani, which we find in these sources, and interestingly, new sources keep popping up every now and again, and they're quite sensational, but Romani is attested from the 16th century, and it wasn't Roma themselves who wrote, it was always outsiders who put together observations, wordless, short sentences, and usually we know, not always, but usually we know where they were acquired. And the picture that we get from already the 16th and 17th century is very, very similar to the picture of dialect differentiation that we find today. So if you know your kind of Romani dialectology, but you don't know the sources, somebody gives you the source, you should be able to quite easily identify which dialect area, landscape that Romany sample was taken from. So that shows us that that differentiation emerged already in that time. And by the 18th century, we already have several dozen sources already, so the documentation becomes much less fragmented, much more intense, and we can very much draw similar isoglosses that we can still see today in Romany. And hence the conclusion that the differentiation of structural Romany dialects emerged in this time. That makes sense, of course, because you've got the immigration, you've got contact with new languages and different languages. So some of that dialect differentiation is internal, but some of it is due to contact with different languages. And here I'll give you some examples. So the Romani word for day derives from Sanskrit divasa. You see dives basically all over, and that would have been the early Romani form. And you see that it lacks any particular geographical pattern. It's there in the periphery and it's there everywhere. But then we have a kind of a central area where there is differentiation, several different isoglosses playing a role. There, loss of S, palatalization, loss of syllables, and so on contained in that particular area that we find here. So loss of the V element there, loss of the S element there, or overlapping. Another example, the word for egg, which we would reconstruct as andro in early Romani. Of course, early Romani is not written, so it's a kind of a reconstruction. Sanskrit anda, and you can see that we have a somewhat different picture. We have kind of an isogloss with the addition of ya in the north, and then we get the yellow forms are the ones that are archaic, and then we get another isogloss in the south, which is the addition of va, and so on. So these are kind of the very typical dialect differentiation patterns that we find in Romani, which once again are very similar to what we find in geographical dialect differentiation in any language. Put these two together, you see that they actually form a nice coherent pattern where there is a cluster of isoglosses. Here I'm just showing two, but there's a cluster of isoglosses around this region. And how is that region significant if we're talking about the 16th and 17th century? We have many isoglosses. I'm just going to run through this quickly now. So lexical isoglosses that run along the same line pretty much. Lexical phonological isoglosses, phonological, morphological isoglosses, other phonological isoglosses, and morphological isoglosses, and others that run through somewhat similar lines, not identical, but partly overlapping. And all of that brings us together into a great divide line, which runs approximately here. You can call it north and south divide. And of course, that line in the time that we're talking about, the 16th, 17th century, was a big important political boundary, shifting 100 miles in various directions over time. But between the Austrian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, a war zone that people didn't cross, especially not minorities, and accounts for the fact that quite often we have developments from the south spreading south, but not to the north, and vice versa. So we have innovations on both sides of the divide, but not crossing the divide. Just want to illustrate that through migration, subsequent migration, we often have several different communities of Romani speakers in one center, particularly urban centers. So you find that definitely in Moscow, with at least two major dialect groups. But my example here is Hamburg, where I learned Romani and started to work on Romani. And we have the group that call themselves Sinti, who arrived there around the mid-16th century. Then we have a group of the Lovara, who arrived there from Transylvania in the 19th century. Then the Polska Roma, who came from Poland in the 1970s, and the Dasikane Roma, who came from Montenegro in the 1980s. And they interact with each other. And so there's a new potential for dialect leveling. So for example, in Hamburg, if you ask somebody, what are you doing here in Romani? You'd find different forms, hokere kai in Sinti, sokeres kate in Lovara, sokeres adai in the Polska Roma dialect, socere kate in Dasikane Roma, and you see there are similarities and differences. And this is a bit of a taste of how similar different Romani dialects are from one another. And one of the interesting things that we can use Romani for as a laboratory of language context, as I was saying, is because we have a language context stratification due to these migrations of Roma from one place to another, but also due to the change in the powers in particular areas over time. So, for example, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Hungarian was an important language of contact in some areas and was succeeded by other languages after the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Ottoman Empire, Turkish was a major contact language in the Balkans, succeeded by other languages after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and so on. So even when the Roma didn't move, sometimes the Roma stayed in their place, but different powers came and went. And sometimes the Roma migrate. And so either way, it gives us a stratification of language contact where we can divide. Well, the potential is infinite, but we've been methodologically dividing it into old L2, recent L2, and current L2. The definition of current being everybody's bilingual in that language. Recent L2 would usually mean the older generation still maintain knowledge of that language, but the younger do not. And old L2 would mean nobody has competence in that language in the community today, but we clearly see that it has had impact in the past on that particular dialect. And that stratification allows us to, beyond just comparing Romani dialects in different places, it allows us to also see the depth of contact-induced change and assign it to particular categories. So we can have a certain dialect where the old L2 contributed certain words, the recent L2 others, and the current L2 other words. And if we find that systematically, that we can compare that across dialects, we get an indication of what is more likely to change or to be adopted from a contact language sooner rather than later. So let me move on to a very partial inventory of contact phenomena in Romani, and I'll emphasize a few principles at the beginning, and then I'll do a more of a kind of an easy rush through some other just for illustration, as I did before with the isoglosses. Here's an example of how Romani people speak. So this is a recording from a recording in Hamburg of somebody belonging to the Luvari group. So these are people who originally immigrated from Transylvania, but in this case via Poland. So they came from Poland in the 1950s to Hamburg. So they've been in Hamburg when this was recorded for one generation, basically. And yet we have discourse particles from German that are completely integrated into the Romani speech. So she says, "La ti familia sas also que savesate penavatisturina." So her family were like, how shall I say, show people, right? With these particles from German. Or here's another, somebody from the same family. And we used to go into the woods and search, and we used to like play, right? So if you know kind of northern varieties of German, you'll be very familiar with these particles, and the feeling that we get from here is that two languages are spoken at the same time, but clearly not at random. So certain elements from German, but wholesale, belonging to a particular type, a particular functional category, are regarded as part of the inventory of Romani. This is not code switching for special effect. This is not a quotation. This is not an explanation. This is just an enrichment of the Romani repertoire features. So I call this fusion, which when applied to a wholesale, to a particular functional category, basically shows us that speakers are, as I was saying before, allowing themselves a discount in maintaining that demarcation line in the repertoire. So they're not separating. There's sets of forms within the repertoire that are just not, where speakers don't bother to separate. They don't bother to say, wait a minute, I'm now talking this language, so these forms are not allowed or not appropriate. Of course, you can only do it unidirectionally. You can't use Romani forms with German speakers because they don't understand them. But given the bilingualism and the social linguistic permissibility of, within the Romani community, these forms are accepted, and they create, to go back to the template that I had before, if we think of multilingualism as repertoire management, so the user trying to maintain this kind of separation, imaginary demarcation line between sets within the repertoire, then we also have a bunch of words, forms, features, sets that are not subject to that separation, or are only subject to that separation in one direction but not to another. In this case, we have German particles that are used whether you're speaking in German or whether you're speaking in Romani, so that demarcation line does not apply to them. Now, what does that mean? That means that it is a change in the behavior of speakers that arises at some point, an acceptance of that change by other speakers, and perhaps the propagation of that same change in behavior, which once again, in our analytic approach to language as a closed system, we as linguists would look at this and say, well, these things belong to the system now, so they have been borrowed. Or in brackets, I once spent a few months at an institute that was devoted to describing endangered languages, and I learned, to my astonishment, that the junior researchers there in that institute were instructed to weed out such elements. So if they were describing languages of, say, Papua New Guinea or the Amazon, and particles like these popped up from the contact languages, they were told, leave them out of your transcriptions because they don't reflect the pure language that we're trying to document. So that gives us another kind of question of epistemology. What is the task of the linguist? To describe how people work, how people communicate, or to set up some kind of imaginary purified form of language. If we want to describe how people actually communicate and how they use language, then of course these particles in this case are inherent part of Romani, but they are at the same time used in German, so there's no separation. When I was writing a grammar of Domari, so the variety, one of the variety of the Dom, spoken in Jerusalem, there were entire paradigms. So Domari borrows, to use that term, modal verbs, for example, from Arabic. And with those modal verbs, it also borrows the person inflection and tense inflection of those verbs. And so you cannot actually write a grammar of Domari and not include entire verb inflection paradigms from Arabic, basically, because otherwise you're writing just part of the grammar. And that again raises the question, can we as linguists, to what extent can we abstract and say, here are the language boundaries when we're talking about spoken languages in a bilingual setting? We're talking about repertoires and what people actually use in communication, and not, strictly speaking, always the language boundaries. We'll give you some insight into the hierarchical nature of borrowing. Here you have a series of Roman dialects, and I won't go through all of them. The names partly speak for themselves. And this is work based on both publications by others and a database of Romani dialects that I've worked on for many years with many, many collaborators, which was displayed on the University of Manchester's websites for almost 20 years, until last week, when the University of Manchester, for reasons unknown to me or to anybody in the research community, deleted all of it and all traces of it. So many, many years of work, dozens of people who contributed millions of pounds in grant money that have been lost through that. So unfortunately, that's not there. We're working to try and kind of reconstruct it if we can. So that has now disappeared, but we still have the data extracted from it in studies like this and numerous others. And if we look at the source and following this method that I alluded to before, old contact language, recent contact language, current contact language, we can do a kind of a stratification of borrowing and compare it just across a hierarchy of here connectors, that is, elements that are of equivalent word class, part of speech category, tends to be placed in the same or similar position in the sentence. And also don't show any significant differences in terms of their inflectional potential, their distribution, or even their structural complexity. So all things being equal, basically the difference between them is a difference of meaning, a difference of semantic pragmatic content, which allows us to narrow down the comparison to a common denominator. And if we look, first of all, down, we see that these three dialects borrow the word for and. These are the ones that borrow the word for or, and these are the ones that borrow the word for but. And if we look more closely, then this also coincides with old and recent contact language. So but is usually from the current contact language, and the other borrowing sometimes from older contact languages. But we see a clear hierarchy, which is implicational. If and is borrowed, then or is also borrowed. And if or is also borrowed, then but is also borrowed. And then the question arises, if this is not a structural issue, nor is it an issue of frequency, then what is it in the semantic pragmatic difference of values between these values that instigates contact? And if we once again understand contact as a change in behavior in terms of managing the repertoire, and if we understand a change of behavior as sensitive to those three pull factors that I described before, what motivation is there to borrow but more likely than or, and so on? What motivation is there for that hierarchy? And it's not about enriching expressive potential, because we know from the history of these dialects that these words existed. So these are replacive borrowings. These are not new concepts. So it has to do somehow with the ease of management, the efficiency, reducing the cognitive burden in managing the repertoire, which gives us insight already that language change through contact is sensitive to the wish to reduce the burden, reduce the load of maintaining that imaginary demarcation boundary when managing the multilingual repertoire. Just to show you a bit more, again from the Dialect of Romany database samples, words such as either or are very frequently borrowed, this is, we've got contact languages here that are Turkish, Greek, Serbian, Italian, Polish, Romanian, Russian, and Hungarian, and elements like of speaker progression, like saying and then. So posle here in Gurbet, potom in the Russian Romani are also elements that are very, very frequently borrowed from the contact languages. If we look at still and already, so somewhat contrast, we have a higher rate of borrowing of already. The red and the blue here indicate the older and the recent contact language respectively. So still can be borrowed, but sometimes more conservative borrowing. So a slower rate of change, but both words are very much prone to borrowing across all Romani dialects. And again, this is not the filling of gaps, because in fact, the fact that we have replacive borrowing, so older and recent contact languages, shows us that, words existed and yet they are replaced again. Or here we have some focus particles, to, only, and even. And here too, we have a bit of a hierarchy. So to is more likely to be retained or inherited, only and even are more likely to be borrowed. So again, we have different dialects, different contact languages, ranging from Finnish to Hungarian to Russian to others, Greek, and so on. So on that basis, and I can't display all details, of course, but on that basis, we can formulate already a number of hierarchies. And that is in terms of borrowing, if and is borrowed, then or is borrowed. Greater than or smaller than indicate the likelihood here. So if one, then the other. If and is borrowed, then or is also borrowed. If or is borrowed, then but is also borrowed. If still is borrowed, then already is borrowed. If to is borrowed, then only and even are also borrowed. And the common theme here is that change and contrast are more prone to borrowing than continuation and addition. Okay, by and large, and we see this across different subcategories. And again, I'd like to think of this in terms of, what is borrowing? Once again, system versus system, and we as linguists ingrained that we look at a borrowing as a change, so in addition to a system. But we look back at practicalities, what happens on the ground. What happens on the ground is that multilingual speakers change their behavior in respect of where do they draw that demarcation line. They change that behavior as a way of balancing the three pull factors. The balancing the three pull factors is uneven when it comes to different semantic pragmatic categories. For some semantic pragmatic categories, there is greater motivation to change where that demarcation line is. In other words, to generalize forms across the repertoire, which we then, as system obsessed linguists look at and label as borrowing. Is everybody with me so far? Maybe I'll just stop for a moment to take a question if there's a clarification question on method, just in case. Good, so I'll move on. So there's more of this, and I'll just rush through just to show you that, you know, we can do this same exercise for all sorts of categories, never and always, and so on. So what do we? So how do we explain this? Perhaps, and I think again, a model of contact should be, in my view, an explanatory model. The epistemology here is to try and use typological method of comparison and hierarchies cross-linguistically, or in this case, across dialects, and to use the discourse pragmatic perspective on how people use language in order to get at some kind of integrated theory that would give us an explanatory model and not just descriptive model. In brackets, this model has been critiqued at times by people who have said, well, I have a counterexample to this hierarchy or to that hierarchy. And, you know, counterexamples sometimes exist. It's about explaining them. If a single counterexample basically nullifies everything else that we've seen elsewhere, then the question is, what is then the alternative theory? And where I kind of find myself contesting those objections is that, you know, of those who occasionally come up with a counterexample to this and that, I haven't yet heard an alternative theory. The alternative theory seems to be anything can be borrowed and there's no regularities. Well, that ignores clearly patterns that we see that occur again and again and again. And I think that it is irresponsible to ignore the recurring patterns because they give us some kind of clue towards explanation. So what do things like focus particles, phrasal adverbs, so like adverbs of change and continuation, indefinites and others, what do they have in common? Well, they all entail some kind of qualification of knowledge. They regard a shared perspective on knowledge, or they somehow process the listener's supplementary knowledge. If you think of an indefinite pronoun, so in terms of word class, it's a pronoun, but that doesn't help us here because the pronouns she or the pronoun there are not usually borrowed. So why is the pronoun somebody often borrowed? Well, somebody does a completely different thing to other so-called pronouns. It opens up an ontological category without specifying. And so the listener has to work to find, to supplement, to know, you know, what is really the specific. So there's a completely different kind of speaker-listener contract than around the word like there, where the speaker can rely on the listener to know exactly what is meant because they share the mapping of the reality or whatever it is that is mapped. So without, again, you know, for reasons of time, I can't go into each and every category, but by and large, it is this interplay of speaker and listener's knowledge needing to supplement one another, or this reliance on a presupposition that is there, that makes these items difficult to process because the speaker, in my perspective, in my opinion, cannot simply rely on the listener to cooperate, or they have to rely. In other words, they basically solicit the listener's active involvement, more so than when saying this is a window. Okay, and the potential there for clashes in expectations and classes and presuppositions is high. Therefore, tension is high. Therefore, the burden on managing the repertoire is high. I'll come back to that in a moment with another illustration. I'm just going to run through some other categories that are very typically borrowed across the Romani sample and to show, so every time I've got this frame where I actually try and explain to them in a semantic pragmatic manner and give the rationale of why I think there is a motivation here to borrow, again, all relating to that dimension of reducing the processing burden when trying to maintain that demarcation boundary. So comparative, for example, are very frequently borrowed across Romani dialects. We have from different languages, po-baro, from Slavic languages, mai-baro, from Romanian, daha-baro, from Turkish, bigger, and so on. So here, what are comparatives? They're a contrast to presupposition. Among prepositions, we have the borrowing of certain prepositions where there is, again, contrast and discontinuity, such as without, instead of, except for, or referential complexity, so something like between, against, beyond, so more than just a single reference point. Among the subordinators, we have particular prone to borrowing are those related to argumentation and modality, again, where we have a potential clash of presuppositions here, whether, for example, dali, chi, li, yesli, and so on, forms that you'll be familiar with. As well as lower semantic integration. Romany has a factual, non-factual distinction, so it's interesting there. If is frequently borrowed, again, we have a relation to modality and insecure knowledge, although, which expresses contract. I mean, these are all lists of, as you can see, forms that are borrowed from various European languages. So again, it's the contact languages, German, Turkish, Russian, Finnish, and so on. In terms of modality, we often have the borrowing of modality expressions, particularly must and can, and there's a hierarchy there. So must, which is an external force, is more prone to borrowing than can, which is an internal force. And then we have conditionality, so forms like b and se from Turkish that express the propositional uncertainty. Evidentiality, so li as in Bulgarian, Macedonian, or mish from Turkish, which again have something to do with propositional uncertainty. And in a completely different domain, numerals are borrowed. So we have within from 1 to 10, the higher numerals are borrowed. And then higher numerals, like 1,000 is borrowed. But calendar dates are also borrowed, and fractions, I don't know why I don't have that here, but fractions are also borrowed. So it's somehow it's the institutional formal counting that motivates borrowing. So where you have kind of procedures that are enacted in a setting where the formal institutional language is used. And then we have others. So we have, for example, borrowing of Slavic aspect or aktionsat prefixes from Russian and Polish and Slovak, particularly the entire set. From German, we have sometimes the borrowing of the so-called verbal particles, which essentially also do something similar as a kind of aktionsat event. So here we have a close configuration of the event conceptualization. So Romani speakers basically share the event conceptualization that they carry out in their contact languages. So taking stock, we have many elements that contribute to interaction management. We have elements that have, I call it here, a shaky presuppositional basis because we have a potential clash between speaker-listener expectations. We have elements that are kind of more beyond reach and control, as in with the complex prepositions. We have formal interaction contexts, which of course instigate another borrowing. I mean, that's been kind of well described, that institutional language terminology gives you a need for borrow. And we have event conceptualization, and all of them somehow have to do with some kind of form of knowledge accessibility. So generally, thinking that we have this from the Romani sample, and that, as I alluded to before, we have confirmation of much of that in the meantime from other comparative language samples of contact around the world. What is easily borrowed and why? And if we come back to this scheme of the different pull factors, with a view particularly of the reduction of hurdles in the way of efficient communication. So what stands in the way of maintaining that demarcation boundaries and can be compromised to make it possible? I come back to the discourse level and just show you a couple of examples of how particular things that we saw here as prone to contact are prone to contact also in actual discourse. This is an example. These examples are hard to come by and it takes years of observation. But this is a Hebrew-English bilingual, not myself, at a Chinese restaurant. It's a woman and she's placing her order in a Chinese restaurant in England. And the waiter comes and she says, and one wonton soup, aval, the vegetarian one. So she uses the Hebrew word aval, but clearly there's a self-repair. It's not a complete self-repair. She doesn't translate, but there's a stop, there's a hesitation, and that. Now, it's been claimed that borrowing is linked to prestige, or it's linked to gaps. Now, it's not linked to gaps. English, she knows English. She knows the word but in English. English has a word but. She's used it before. She's used it again. There is no prestige, believe me, in using Hebrew with a Chinese waiter in a restaurant in English. That doesn't get you anywhere. It doesn't get you any bonus point, not even a discount on the soup. So there's an issue here of processing. There's an issue of control. There's a lapse in control over the selection and inhibition mechanism, and that is shown very well in the transcription that shows that there's a hesitation. Just one more. This is an adult German-Polish bilingual who's learning English. So basically, she's Polish, but living in Germany, so fluent in both those languages. She's now spending time in England for a few weeks to brush up her English, which is not very good. She meets up with two friends with whom she speaks German. And one of them says to her, across the street, there's this restaurant, and it's organized very much, kind of decorated very much in Polish style. So she goes over, takes a look, and then she comes back and she confirms, and she says, bis auf die Tischdecken, because, weil sie, except for the tablecloth, because. So what does she use here? Because this is not her native language. It's not her stronger language. In fact, it's the language that she knows least of the three. So why is the switch there? There's clearly a loss of control, clearly, again, around something that is interaction managing, around kind of the argumentative particle. But it is the language to which most of her attention is dedicated right now, because she's learning English and very much trying to maintain competence in English. So her, I would call it the pragmatically dominant language at that particular point in time for her. And she kind of slips into that. But there's a lapse of control, again, around these interaction management elements. And if we try to relate this to a model of language processing, or a variant thereof, and we assume that, we start with a communicative goal and run it through some kind of conceptualizer. This is, that gives us what is the content of what we want to say. The intended output is some kind of combination of words and constructions that I'm kind of listing in an abstract way. Now, for a bilingual, this would run through what people have referred to as the executive control. So that's what carries out those all operations. Now, you've got all sorts of lemmas and constructions and everything else that is involved. Some of them tagged or known to be appropriate in this situation, and others in that situation. In other words, the two languages that you have. And normally, you would run this through some kind of selection and inhibition mechanism, a mechanism that would allow you to select those forms that are appropriate for this particular context and inhibit those that are, in terms of their meaning, functional, but not appropriate in the particular context of the interlocutor or the setting or whatever, so not in the right language. So we have that working, except here at some point, there is all of a sudden a word from the wrong language. It's the right word, but in the wrong language, which shows us that there's been some kind of lapse or failure of the selection and inhibition mechanism, but only around that particular task. And again, it doesn't help us, in my view, to look at parts of speech in terms of the linear structure of the sentence or the inflection potential. It's actually the semantics pragmatics of what they instigate, what sort of mental operation tasks they instigate, that allows us to explain why are they a burden right now on the selection inhibition mechanism in such a way that they clash with the processing in such a way that one loses control around them. So a lapse in selection and inhibition can be a result of interactional tension arising through different presuppositions. When an intuitive gesture is involved that escapes control. When something is paralexical, perhaps, and we don't remember that it belongs to this language or that language, or don't necessarily assign it a language specific, or complex processing, or all of those together. It could also involve pathological situations, such as being tired or being drunk, if you're in those kind of cultures that you are sometimes drunk or tired or whatever. So all of these states may lead to some kind of lapse there in the selection and inhibition. And my argument is that it is those lapse when they become accepted, when they are repeated, and when they are disseminated, propagated around the community, that leads to language change. They lead to a kind of a change in behavior. And if we look at what is easily borrowed and why, then we've seen discourse markers, connectors, modality markers, indefinites, comparatives. All of those elements have somehow to do with an insecure knowledge base. So they have to do somehow with international external tension. We see evidence of lapses in selection and inhibition when we have the opportunity to look at bilingual discourse, as in the two examples that I've shown. What is not easily borrowed, and we don't find frequently borrowed, are, for example, personal pronouns, definite articles, demonstratives, just to name some. What do they have in common that is different from the, also case markers, person and tense inflection are rarely borrowed. And that is, I mean, some people will, again, sensationalize the one or two counterexamples. I'll come back to a counterexample, so-called, in a moment. But the counterexamples are the exception that proves the rule, because there's no doubt that when we look at samples around the world, we do have a pattern. And it's up to us to explain the pattern, right, rather than explain it away, in my view, through sensationalizing outlier counterexamples. If we come back to this model here, the question then, if borrowing is a product of a balancing act of the pull factors, are certain things impossible to borrow, or is simply the case that there is no need to borrow? So is borrowing a kind of a tsunami that comes at you and it is inevitable, and only those things survive that are resilient? Or is borrowing rather seen as an opportunity, so you take those things that make processing sort of easier? So there isn't the kind of protection. Those things that are not necessarily attractive to borrowing are not being borrowed. And when I say attractive, it's not in terms of their aesthetics, of course, or their meaning, because obviously cultural innovations, words that are borrowed, but rather when looking at grammar in terms of processing functions. So I'd like to look at a kind of an outlier example, and that is personal pronouns in Romany. It's an interesting example. So Romany, early Romany, we reconstruct ov, oi for the three singular, he, she, and on for the plural. And this is a form that is found across many, many Romani dialects. Some have an addition of a consonant v or ya at the beginning, but it's basically the form that we find everywhere. Now, Hungarian, as you may know, has, by coincidence, certain similarities. So one syllable ö and ök for singular and plural. Now, Hungarian Romani, some dialects have ov and oi, and then in the plural they have onk. Now, what is borrowed here? It is obviously not the Hungarian plural pronoun, but it is an element of it, the plural ending, which is also a nominal plural ending in Hungarian, and probably instigated through the chance similarities. Slovene, as you know, has on and oni, and Slovene Romani has ov, oi, and oni. Now, oni looks as if it's a Slovene borrowing, and it looks as though it's a counterexample to pronouns aren't borrowed. But in fact, again, e, of course, is the general nominal plural ending. And so it is the similarity, the chance similarity between on and oni that instigates the borrowing, the fact that that e is also borrowed as a plural marker with nouns as well. And if that's not enough, just one more. Turkish has, again, coincidentally, very similar on, when it's case marked, it's on, onu, ona, and so on, and onlar in the plural, and certain dialects in Romani contact with Turkish have of, oi, and onlar. So that's just an assimilation. Again, lar in Turkish is also the general nominal plural, and there's the coincidental similarity of on. So when we have an exception, a counterexample, there is often an explanation in terms of analogy or other conventional linguistic processes of change. And we can explain the counterexample. The theory doesn't fall on the counterexamples, such as these. I'll skip the next few couple of examples because they prove the same point, and go to interim conclusions that grammatical borrowing is hierarchical. And I therefore think that it allows insights into the architecture of the language faculty. And that layered architecture is a product of the gradual evolution of the language faculty. That's my hypothesis. And with that, I'd like to come to my last point, which is how this relates to language evolution. A moment. Now, there are many approaches to language evolution, all of them obviously speculative to a considerable extent. I'll name just a couple for reference. It's a bit basic division, as you will know, between the idea of a sudden outburst or a sudden mutation that created what Burke and Chomsky a few years ago called merge, which is the capacity to form recursion, so to embed things into one another. So they basically say, there's a certain genetic mutation that is specific to humans, and that created that capacity for merge. The capacity to combine, to form recursion, is the basis of syntax, which is the basis of language. And opposing that view, there is the view that language is the product of a gradual evolution from pre-human forms of communication, and that is pretty much the view that is held by everybody else. So including anthropologists and cultural anthropologists and paleontologists and some linguists. And to name just a couple, so Heine Kuteva, for example, try to relate the evolution of language faculty to a theory of grammaticalisation. And just like in a single language, nouns can become verbs, can become demonstratives, and so there's a certain hierarchy in terms of which parts of speech turn into other parts of speech. So they assume that this will have been the history of the language faculty, that first of all we had nouns, and then we used the nouns to describe activities and attributes. So they gave us verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. And then we used those to grammaticalize further to more abstract things like demonstratives. And finally, once we had sentences and put them together, we'd grammaticalize them further to subordinators, agreement markers, and so on. So it's essentially a structural parts of speech, word class oriented approach to the gradual faculty, where certain word classes are seen as more archaic than others, because that's what we see in terms of current language, the evolution of categories within languages. Tomasello, who's a cultural anthropologist, has a very, very different approach to language evolution, and he views language as basically cooperative communicative behavior that arises through intentionality. And in his view, if there was a genetic mutation that made the difference, it's the ability to view the other as an intentional agent, something that apes and dogs and so on don't have, but humans, unique to humans. And so the first thing, according to Tomasello, in the evolution of languages is attention-getting gestures, which otherwise in animal communication occur only instinctively. So there are warning signs that birds have and dogs have and so on, but nobody intentionally thinks, oh, let me get Mira's attention because she's drifting away now, so let me make some kind of gesture to get her attention back. That was just an example, a fictitious one. I didn't think you were drifting away. I was saying, so that kind of intentionality doesn't exist in animal communication. From that ability allows the ability to request, to take the joint attention once it's there, once it's obtained, as a common ground to instigate somebody else's action. From that, according to Tomasello, we get informing, so random form vocal imitation, perhaps, barking like a dog to say that there's a dog coming, from which we get words. So through onomatopoetic formations. And finally, the ability to put together more complex propositions, which gives rise to narration. So narration inherently includes also sharing attitudes, not just information, and that leads to complex constructions. So this is basically an action-oriented approach to the evolution of the language faculty. And finally, Ardila gives a very nice, basically compilation of different works on the neuropsychological mapping of language functions, and shows us that, in fact, there is it's supposed to be neurophysiological. Well, psychological is not wrong, but it's neurophysiological. So different areas of the brain are responsible for the production of noises, which we also have in animals, versus phonetic symbolism, so actual physical syllable production with lexical meaning, and once again, for the ability to combine grammar and verbs. Now, we know that from different kinds of aphasia and also from neuroimaging, that processing these different functions occurs in different ways. So there's a physiological dimension. And if there's a neurophysiological mapping, then obviously that means it's a product of different stages of the physical evolution of the human brain. So how do we relate this back to language context? So I propose that there's a link between borrowing and archaism. Archaism in terms of not the individual language, but in terms of the language function in the history of human evolution. The more something is borrowable, as I proposed before, it means that the more prone it is to lapses of executive control. The causality is the other way around, of course. So something that is more prone to lapses of the executive control is more borrowed. So the explanation is that it's prone to lapses of the executive control. And those elements, in turn, are more instinctive, so less easily controlled. And those that are more instinctive and less easily controlled are the more archaic, the closer to when we were animals, or the closer to the way animals communicate. By contrast, those elements that are less borrowable tend to be those that are more easily controlled. So they're less prone to lapses of the executive control, of the selection inhibition. Those are the ones that are more analytical. Those are the ones that are a later cognitive development, not shared with animals by and large. So, well, not shared at all with animals, but that's one of their characteristics. So from a contact linguistic perspective, with that in mind, we would expect that something like prosodic and facial expression of emotion, which is pretty much universal in human language, not always with the same meaning, but by and large, we can often tell if somebody is angry or not by their intuition, even if we don't know the language, unless they're British and they don't show their emotions. But otherwise, we can kind of tell through prosody. So that sort of universal, conventionalized expression of emotions will have followed, and they can be paralexical interjections, collaborative markers, but something that caters to those very early functions of communication that Tomasello presents, followed by modality, which is essentially requesting, what I call monitoring and directing. So basically manipulating the other in some way, to instigating actions by the other, followed by informing, which is what we need the lexicon for, followed by the predication, which is basically taking information and embedding it into a shared perspective on events. That's what a predication essentially is, which we carry out through verbs or tense aspect and so on. And finally, with indexicality. So indexicality is things like anaphora, deixis, that presuppose an abstract mapping, something highly analytical, which basically take language in itself and turn it into an abstract map that we can navigate through. The highly complex in that sense, or highly analytical. And so finally, I would propose this scenario of language evolution. We have at some point a kind of pre-human advanced communication device. And I'm not in a position to say whether it was, which kind of hominid had that. I don't know if anybody is, but somewhere in the transition between, the apes that we see today and the hominids that are still living today, there are all sorts of other hominids and stages. But things like meaningful use of pitch and intensity of voice, which we find with some animals, meaningful use of rhythm and repetition, which we find with some animals, meaningful facial expression, which we find with some animals, instinct-driven gestures, which we find, in various animal species, all of which serve certain communications. Now, we haven't lost those. We still have them, except that we don't rely exclusively on them. We have an enriched repertoire, but we haven't lost them. They're still with us. It's followed by an early human, what we might call a social communication device. So this doesn't necessarily need language as we have them today, but verbalized gestures. So gestures that have a new function, the functions that Tomasello calls manipulating the intentional agent, the other who we see as an intentional agent. So it requires thinking about who is the other, what do they think, what do they expect, and how do we intervene to get them to do what we want, and so on, which we don't have in the animal kingdom. So it's not pre-human, this is early human. So things like prompting, rejection, approval, and also certain responses to presuppositions, so expressing in some way or other modality, surprise, contrast. And I don't mean modality in the sense of complex counterfactuality necessarily, but modality simply in the sense that I want you to do this. Okay, some kind of request in a basic level. Followed by what we might have the early human verbal language. So the beginning of conventionalized referential expressions that give information, like words, and certain techniques to combine words, such as reduplication and juxtaposition, again, that are still with us. Reduplication is, of course, very, very widespread in languages of the world in different ways. And followed finally by what I might call kind of the advanced human verbal language, which might be proto-language. So what all languages originally then derived from. So the one that has predications, allows propositional chains, and particularly has the ability to map context through abstract pointers and lexical devices, which of course don't occur in animal communication. And then after all of that in Africa, and then we have the out of Africa and the diversification of human languages as we know them today, which of course we have things like further erosion of the sound-meaning relationship. So in Hebrew, this is called bakbuk, because you turn it over, it goes buk, 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 buk. But most words in our vocabulary today are not onomatopoetic, and that's why we don't understand other languages unless we learn them. Analogies, grammaticalization, conventionalization of information structuring, mapping intonation patterns to elocution, as well as, of course, the emergence of indexical subcategories. So not all languages have definite articles or adjectives or numerals, of course. So these are things that were not necessarily part of proto-language, but could have been part of the diversification of human language. So to conclude on the overall map of human communicative devices, we have some still that are shared with non-humans. We have many that are shared by all humans, and some that are population specific. Those, of course, tend to be those that we as linguists have a particular interest in. And in terms of the implications for that big debate about language evolution, so the debate that has the camp that sudden outburst versus gradual evolution, maybe there's a compromise there if we view Chomsky's merge as a key significant step in human language evolution and relate it, rather than to the very specific generative concept of recursion, if we relate it to predication grammar. And predication grammar seems to be a key to a completely different kind of communication that would have existed before. But if we did that, we would still have to, of course, acknowledge that merge, to continue to use the Chomskyan term, is embedded into an evolution sequence of communicative devices. It's not isolated. So merge is not, in that sense, the earliest development in the uniquely human language faculty. It's just a significant step, if, again, we align it with the predication, a significant step in the human language faculty, one that is universal, one that was definitely part of proto-human language. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll stop sharing now and whoops.
Thank you, Yaron.
Yeah.
Do we have time for questions or?
Yes, we do. I have at least 15, 20 minutes, and then I have to go to my.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So the doc is open for questions, discussion, and considerations, concerns, complaints, everything. As usual, you can ask your questions via chat or raise your hand in the participants panel.
There was actually one question in chat already.
It's rather a comment than question, so.
Okay.
Yeah, so pretty much, I've been talking about some of these things for many years, certain elements, especially the issue of the lapses. And pretty much every time I talk about it, at least one person and usually a few come up and say, oh yeah, I remember it happened to me or it happened to my grandmother. So yeah, I do think, I mean, it's very difficult to get a comprehensive corpus because you can't experiment. You can't condition somebody through experiment to make a mistake, as far as I know. And it's very difficult to be there with a microphone or even notes when people do that. But I think, you know, all of us, it resonates. So those examples that I have been able to document and others have documented, they resonate when people can relate them to their experience or their own informal observations. Yes, please.
There's a question, Yuda. Yuda, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your really insightful talk and really interesting. I have two questions. The first one is talking about counter examples. Is it worth explaining them using looking for explanations, or they just can happen?
It depends. I mean, there's different people. I don't want to go into kind of names. You can look out there and see. I mean, there's various. But you know, there's somebody who some years ago decided to look at 45 languages that I didn't look at, and that's not a problem. There's plenty of languages out there in relation to the connectors, and found that there were two counterexamples. And the emphasis was kind of on the counterexamples. I would think, okay, you know, why is the other 43, why do they align themselves with a prediction? These are not laws of physics, but even laws of physics, you know, I can hold something in my hand without dropping it. And that doesn't mean that Newton's first law about gravity is incorrect. It means that in Newton's term, there's an unbalanced force that is acted upon the force of gravity. So when we find kind of counter or exceptions or counterexamples, I think we need to look for the unbalanced force. And I illustrated that before with the issue of pronouns in Romany, the fact that we have coincidental similarity between on and oni and so on. And the fact that we also have the fact that the plural pronoun is constructed in a way that is analyzable like a plural noun in all of these languages. Those two coincidences put together in 3 different contact languages of Romany give us similar outcomes in these 3 dialects. They're explainable through other processes of language change that we know, such as analogies and leveling and generalization. And that's the unbalanced force that works in that way, that doesn't render invalid the entire theory. But in any case, even if there, I mean, in some cases, it's a matter of terminology. For example, I have generalized that spectral markers are more likely to, are less likely to be borrowed, more likely to be borrowed, sorry, than tense aspect, but less likely than modality. Now, if you take the Russian or other Slavic Aktionsart prefixes, and we often call them, when we talk about Russian grammar, we often call them aspect, but they're not aspect in the universal sense. They are Aktionsart, okay, which is why I think Ostendal coined the term Slavic aspect, or maybe it was Bernard Combray, but and if you then take that and you call it aspect and you do a statistical comparison, but you're counting up to 16. So anyway, you know, in a statistical comparison, when does it become meaningful? And you go, okay, I've got 14 modality markers, but 16 aspect borrowed because I've included all the Slavic aspect, you know, then that's a different kind of discussion. That doesn't question the theory, in my view, and so on. So one can argue point by point with the examples. With the counterexamples. I haven't seen them yet or read that they have been used to formulate an alternative theory, except in the sense of what Sarah Thomason once called, or at least has been attributed to her, anything goes. You know, but anything goes is, in my view, not a theory. Anything goes is a counter theory. It basically means that everything you say about predictions and hierarchies is rubbish. I mean, that's not valid. But I think it needs a more serious challenge than that. So once again, anything goes is valid if one were to interpret the hierarchical predictions as constraints in the sense of, I think we're all somehow impacted by this logic of generative grammar, that a constraint is absolute, that if you formulate a law, then it's the law and nothing can break it. And I don't think that in linguistic typology or social linguistics or the other domains that I work in, that a prediction is a law. There are exceptions, and once again, I interpret these hierarchies in terms of motivation. My question is not what can you not borrow. My question is, what are you motivated to borrow? It's a different question. And if you say, what are you motivated to borrow, then I have no argument with the anything goes. Yes, anything goes, but not in the same frequency. And because there are different motivations that are valid. I never said that there's something that can never, ever be borrowed. But it is an empirical fact when you look at corpora that some elements are more likely to be borrowed than others, and that there are implicational hierarchies. And I think it would be irresponsible, as I was saying before, not to pay attention to that and to try and use that by way of an explanatory model.
Thank you a lot. I have another question, Mira Borisovna. Can I?
Please go ahead.
It is about the definition of bilingualism now, when people when people can learn and be good at any language starting at any age, should we reconsider a definition of bilingualism, something that starts from birth and not late, like not in the adulthood?
No. That is a very simple answer from my side. I think bilingualism is the ability to use and manage a multilingual repertoire. So
if a person learns the second language and being an adult, he's bilingual.
Well, if we want to specifically mean that somebody's bilingual from birth, then we can say they're bilingual from birth. We have that extra attribute. Oh, yes. So if we say that somebody's bilingual from infancy, then that's the state of affairs. If not, then somebody can be bilingual through later acquisition. I don't see a problem. It's very convenient terminological dichotomy there.
Thank you a lot.
And do we have time for one more question?
Yes, of course we do. Yes, Mira, go ahead.
Yes, Mira.
Yeah. Thank you, Yaron. That was fantastic, coming from very detailed descriptions of specific dialectal features to the whole theory of evolution. As I understand, if I'm not mistaken, you are talking about the borrowings as a motivation for borrowings, as an attempt to lessen cognitive load.
Yes.
But
not exclusively, but I think that's one motivation, particularly in grammar. Not in vocabulary, of course. We borrow the word Sputnik because it's different from the word, I don't know, spaceship or whatever. So sometimes it's a matter of precision of expression. And that, of course, in terms of cultural vocabulary, procedural vocabulary, greetings, there's a different motivation there, of course. But I'm talking about grammatical items.
Yeah, speaking about grammatical, and I think I'm conceptual. I'm talking about certain conceptualizations. Can you make peace between this idea of lessening cognitive load?
Yes.
I mean, for the speaker, probably for the borrower, the one who borrows, and the general idea that when you have when you have a conversation and interaction between people sharing different repertoires, like I speak 2 languages and I choose which language to speak to another person, I'm actually thinking about the lessening of cognitive load, or actually exterminating this cognitive load because of the language.
Well, you're not thinking about it literally. I mean, I don't think it's a process of reflection. I think it's an instinctive. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's a contradiction. Cognitive load for me, or which is which could be described as a speaker targeted communication, as opposed to the listener targeted communication when you're not thinking, yes, of course, but you're choosing your repertoire according to the needs of the listener. Isn't there any contradiction between these two statements?
No, I don't think so, because I mean the core is in the observation of lapses of control. The lapses of control are non-voluntary. They occur with the speaker. They're not reciprocal. We saw that in the two examples. You know, the Chinese waiter, there's nothing that using the Hebrew word doesn't help in any way. It doesn't connect. In fact, it ignores the expectations of the Chinese waiter. It's sort of counter listener in that sense. So it's something non-voluntary. And of course, that's the reason that in that particular setting, that's not going to prevail. But those kind of changes perpetuate themselves, for example, in the Romani community, where everybody accepts that German discourse particles, for instance, can be part of the discourse in Romani. So I do think that it's a speaker control, but of course they can only perpetuate themselves if listeners accept and if there's some kind of reciprocality later on. Otherwise, they would be one-offs and will not lead to change. So the difference here in terms of the speaker-listener collaboration is not whether or not something occurs, but whether it will perpetuate and lead to language change.
And that's basically the hardest part of it, because if you take these two processes as two poles of the client of the scale, then we need some mechanism, I don't know, some instrument to describe how this occasional lapses of control with a given speaker lead to borrowings. It's still this question here.
Yeah, well, we have, yeah, I agree, but we have some evidence, and I describe it in my book in a couple of case studies. So we have observations on idiolects, individuals who emigrated, 40 years ago. And in the meantime, they've borrowed conjunctions from the contact language. Now, they're not part of a community, so we can't see language change. We can only see the change in their individual speech. And so on. So we've got that from different places. So I think there is, and we also have that from longitudinal observations. Sometimes we have now more and more work on so-called heritage languages or diaspora languages, and there's some evidence from there. Yes, but to have the ideal documentation, we would have to go from being able to document lapses to a longitudinal study in the whole community. That's of course very difficult. So what we have to do is cross-reference, some piece of data from here with other data from there. That's why I try to cross-reference discourse data with typological surveys, and we need to kind of make some kind of conclusions from that. They're not self-evident. Let's take perhaps one more question because somebody else has their hand up there.
Yeah, can we afford one more question?
Yes, sure.
Okay, perfect. So Dmitry, go ahead.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. I've missed the middle of it, but I'll ask anyway. Where to place evidentiality in hierarchy?
It's not easy to answer that kind of question because there isn't a single hierarchy. So I can't, if your question is where to place it in the hierarchy, there isn't one single hierarchy. Yeah. There's several. But I'll just say, and I did mention evidentiality, we do find that it's quite prone to contact-induced change because it precisely organizes presupposition. So there's not many examples that I know of. There's basically two. Well, there are evidentiality is commonly an areal trait. So even though markers are not necessarily borrowed from one language to another, languages that in a particular area will often tend to have some kind of marker of evidentiality. And that I think relates to the kind of shared event conceptualization and modality. And then in some languages, minority languages, actual evidential markers are borrowed, such as li from Bulgarian or mish from Turkish are borrowed as morphemes into other languages. So I would place it sort of, to try and answer your question directly around the area of modality and perhaps somewhat lower than conditionality. But once again, there isn't just the one hierarchy. The hierarchies have to be, for example, around particular word classes where everything else is equal. So I can look at and, but, or as a hierarchy because they're all connectors, they share certain formal characteristics, and so on. So evidentiality would have to be accommodated on the hierarchy, perhaps modality, tense, aspect, evidentiality. And over there, I would just intuitively put it just under modality and before aspect, if that helps. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I need to
Thank you very much, Yaron. Thank you for
move on,
coming.
and,
Thank you for the fascinating talk, and thank you for sharing your stimulating thoughts with us. Thank you so very much
for the invite, and hopefully see you all soon somewhere face to face as well.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you very much, Yaron.